When the war started, I was 19. I was part of the student body and part of Bohemia, you might say, a lot of artist friends we had. And we rented 1 or 2 rooms, that's what we lived on. My mother was a realtor and she educated herself, spoke fluent German, French, English, and was a whiz at math. She was very clever. My grandmother already had refugees from First World War, so it was like a tradition. And there were a lot of refugees from Hitler. And my mother was secretary of the Women's Peace Movement. And all these people waited for visa, sometimes in our house. So we knew a lot about what was going on there. We were scared to death. She was fearless. We were scared to death, but she was fearless. In a way, when she thought she was right, she said, if you're right, you win. And she's the only person that I know of that scared the Gestapo. Gestapo came to visit her, and the 4 or 5 guys looking all over her house, and the head sent them away because it was a small apartment. And he said, sit down. I have a whole dossier about your family. Your whole family is helping Jews, and you know it's punishable by death. And she said, you have no proof. You arrested my son, he's in jail, and you have no proof whatsoever. He said, yes, we had a lot of silver we found in his house, and silver with somebody else's initials, probably Jewish. And so she took a drawer with all her silver, threw it on the dining table, and she said, we buy in auctions. That's what my son did. Mm-hmm.
Put them aside.
So he said, sit down. But, you know, he had lost a point, and that was what my underground boss told me. Try to make a point that where you're in charge and you win that argument. And you have to be tactful about it because they can kill you. You know, if they don't like one girl said, where are you taking me? So he just shot her. So anyway, you're under arrest, you're going to go to jail. And they'd said jail, they didn't say concentration camp, but it was big posters that said punishable by death to helping Jews. So they would look through the whole house, take all the pictures off the wall, roll up the rugs, bang in the closets, put bayonets through the closets. You know, they did open the door, but, you know, in the clothes. And my mother would always shake and tremble, so I'd hold my arm around her.
The story of Henry Pollock, a newspaper columnist.
Yeah, he called the day after the invasion, that morning. The planes were still buzzing overhead, bombing Rotterdam. And he called my mother if he and his wife could shelter in our house. He was sure that he would be one of the first to be arrested. A Jew, anti-Nazi. He was a famous columnist with his picture in the paper, you know. So my mother said yes. And then he came to our house, but we brought him to my grandmother's house. 1, we were scared. 2, we had 2 rooms rented already. And my grandmother said right away yes also. She admired him. He had been a co-founder of the free-thinking movement with my grandfather, and my grandparents were free thinkers or atheists. And so he was a very famous man. We said, well, pretend you don't know him, you don't read the paper. But I read the paper every day. Well, we'll come and throw all your papers out. At Volkskrant was a socialist democratic paper. And she said, but all my chests are lined with the paper. Oh, we'll get rid of that. And my mother and I went over there with the Polacks, and we sat on the floor in the kitchen trying to get the paper, but it was glued on. So we had little strips all on the newspaper. And my mother said, "Mother, why were you so cheap? Why didn't you buy shelf paper?" You know, yeah, you knew Hitler was coming, right? You buy shelf paper. Anyway, so we tried to laugh about things. We did. It was an absurd question.
Could you describe how you dealt with the increasing need for acquiring or creating false identity cards?
Well, I stole a lot of them. You know, fellow students, and whenever I saw a pocketbook, I would, very handy, I'd quickly get their identity cards out. And a friend and I would invite people for tea, give them a lot of tea, and then they had to go to the bathroom, and we'd take their identity cards out of the pocketbook. And at my aunt's funeral, I had a lot of cards from everybody keeping their pocketbooks out there. Yeah. And then later I had a friend who was an artist who made, I don't know how she did it, but she made very good cards, identity cards. Hannah Neubauer, Jewish girl herself. Yeah. And I took fingerprints, you know, took a little seal off and then made a photo with the fingerprint and then sealed it back in. So that was in '41, but then things got better and better and I didn't have to make them anymore.
Can you tell us something about your visits to those in hiding for whom you were the only contact they had with the outside?
Yeah, I would bring them coupons for food and money from the underground for their keep. And it wasn't a lot, but like $50, 50 guilders a month. And I brought a little girl, and I got her $50 a month. And I got her out of the ghetto on the back of my bike.
How old was the little girl?
3. She stayed first with us, and she wouldn't eat.
Your mother did the same, too, no?
Well, it was my mother's house, and she would have borne the brunt of the punishment, you know. But sometimes I told her to go away when we knew we were going to be visited, because we had somebody at the Gestapo who warned us, "You're going to have visitors." And I would tell my mother, "Why don't you go away and I'll try to deal with it, and then we'll figure out a story, who are they looking for, and how we could lie our way out." And they would separate us and then interview us, you know. They were stupid, but not that stupid, yeah. Well, they usually came in mufti, ordinary clothes, and rang the bell, and then they'd open the door wide with drawn guns, Gestapo, as if you didn't know, right? And then they threw me in a chair, usually, my mother threw, if she was home, and asked hundreds of questions. And I can't tell you what they said, because I had to lie about everything, and I try to forget what they said anyway.
Sure.
Yeah.
I understand Hans de Jong stayed with you
For 2 years till the end of the war. And he had to go into another house several times, close by, fortunately, and another friend who would have him for, you know, a couple of days. But he couldn't stay there. She also had transitory people.
Because I had read that his bookkeeper, Hans's bookkeeper, was arrested.
And he betrayed him, yeah.
No one could know if that address information was going to be used.
Yeah, and he came at least once a month with books, you know, and he was a bookkeeper, yeah.
When the bookkeeper was arrested, what did you do?
But we just heard that he was arrested. We didn't do anything. We just made sure that we were prepared and that Hans wasn't there.
And you pretended not to know that Hans was Jewish because he had blue eyes and blonde hair.
Yeah. And they said, those Jews are very clever. They know how to hide. And they hide like die Veilchen im Walde. That means like the violets in the woods. And I was very touched by the poetry of it. I mean, they were nuts. They were really totally obsessed with Jews. And it was their bread and butter. The Gestapo didn't have to go to the front. So they liked to arrest us, of course, and scare us. Sure. And also teach us. Some of them had this mission to convert us to their beliefs. So they were telling us about how bad the Jews were and how the whole money market was in their hands and so on. And we should watch out for them. And they said, we can show you what a Jew looks like. And they had photos of eye corners, like 6 in a row, 6 in a row. And we pretended we had to go to headquarters and study this. I wish I'd asked for a copy, but you know, in that time, the photos was very rare. So we pretended to study this seriously, you know. And that's how you recognize Jews. Oh, we said, so if you see somebody with an eye corner like that, give us a call. And I got a card. All right, okay. I mean, I was not John Wayne, you know, telling them what we knew, you know. But I was very polite and spoke perfect German. And my mother and I kind of seduced them into believing we were just stupid and innocent. And we rented rooms and we weren't very rich. And they bought our story time and again.
You mentioned you were fluent in German, but you were trained to ask for an interpreter if under arrest.
Yeah, but for Hans de Jong, I thought we better hear what they know. So I found out that they knew all the homes Hans de Jong had been in. And he had sent out, I heard him say, go to this and that address, go to that address, and those were his previous addresses. So I knew more of what they knew than they knew about us, so that was very handy. And I said, you know, I was supposed to go to my grandmother's for dinner. Could I call her? It's almost 6 o'clock. Okay, but you can only say, I'm not coming for dinner. Don't they realize that you don't do that to your grandmother? So I said, okay, I called her. And fortunately, my best friend, a Jewish girl, Tirza van Amelo, who was a Zionist and went later in 45 to Israel illegally. She was at my grandmother's hiding at that time. My grandmother always had people too, you know. So she answered the phone because my grandma was kind of deaf. And I said, I'm not coming for dinner. And she said, you weren't coming for dinner. You're having visitors, right? I said, yes. And she said, you want me to call your mother? I said, yes. And then the Dolmetscher hung up my phone. So my mother didn't come home that day.
So speaking German enabled you not only to overhear information you were not intended to be privy to, did it not also buy you time in
Absolutely.
preparing your
Yes,
answers?
yes. Could hear the question in German and the question in Dutch. And so I could find better answers, yeah. And they didn't wise up to that very much.
Good.
Yeah, yeah. they thought they were very fair, and they were just going to teach us about the Jews. A lot of them did that.
I read that you were, nervous and crossing and uncrossing your legs.
Oh, yeah, well,
Catching the
one
attention of the
time
officer.
I said, I'm alone at home, can I help you, Gestapo? So they each took me by a wrist, a practiced movement I could see, and it threw me against the wall, which knocked me out for a moment. And I was sort of knocked out, and I started trembling, uncontrollable shaking. And I knew I shouldn't show that I was scared. So I was holding onto the chair they threw me in, and I had shorts on, and my legs were trembling. So to control that, I went like this. And then he was sitting about that distance, and he said, "Your legs don't impress me at all." And I stopped shaking. It was very interesting. The language, the communication was totally on a different level all of a sudden. So he was scared of me. Isn't that interesting?
Because I was going to ask you, how did his remark change your attitude? How did it help you see him just as a man?
Yes, indeed, yes, yeah. And he was scared. No decent Dutch woman would speak to them. So they were very lonely. And my boss said, "Don't show you're afraid. The sadist in them will revive." Yeah.
I read that you had coached your mother at one point in time to don't show them you're afraid.
Yes.
You've done nothing to be afraid of. You've done
We're
nothing
right
wrong.
and they're wrong.
And convince yourself by reciting this.
Yeah, yeah.
To help steady your nerve.
And we're innocent. We haven't done anything wrong.
Which is amazing. It's amazing how that made it a little bit easier.
Well, you sort of put blinders on like a horse and focus on giving the right answer and not be afraid and be both, let's say, pretty girl, attractive, innocent, stupid, and cooperative. Since we had so many raids, we tried to place people in farms in the country. It was much safer, and there was food and heat, And, well, our house was not very safe. And we also had a radio. We listened to BBC and the Queen talking. And when we told everybody, Winston Churchill is going to speak. And we had as many as 35 hiders come to our house. And they'd ring the bell, ta-ta-ta-ta, who is it? And they'd tell the name, and then on the second and third floor we lived.
Where was it hidden? How was it?
Well, under a floorboard, and of course that was punishable by death too. So, but my mother, in a way, was fearless too. She wanted to hear the news. So we did it anyway, and people loved us for it because you have no idea how important news is. You all read papers, you listen to the news, in the morning, in the evening, and if you have no news except a tiny little newspaper full of lies, it's very, very hard, that life. And so we had underground papers, and I always had a big pack of them, and that was one of the things I did, distribute the underground papers. So I was a busy girl, yeah.
I wanted to ask about the carpenter that paid a visit.
Oh yeah, it was a very nice man with a big box with tools. And he said, "I'm a carpenter from the underground. I'm coming here to make a hiding place if you show me around." And my mother said, "Do you know him?" I said, "No, but I know who sent him. And I think he's trustworthy." You had to trust people. So he made a wonderful hiding place in the attic on the 4th floor. Actually, the house was built out of 3 separate homes, and the attics were still separated. So even though you came in our attic, unless you knew, you couldn't get into the others.
Perfect.
Yeah, it was perfect. And I think you've heard the story of Hannah Neubauer. Well, if I had a warning that Gestapo was coming, I would call everybody, especially the Jewish people, don't come, we're going to have visitors, hang up. And so I called Hannah, I said, don't come, we're going to have visitors. She came anyway. She was another fearless person. And she was walking up the stairs to the 2nd floor, and there was the Gestapo. So I ran ahead, grabbed her, and said, we're going to a hiding place. I said to my mother, you talk to them, you talk to them, don't shake, don't. And so I put Hannah in the hiding place. And they didn't stay too long, just a friendly visit. And they left, and I went upstairs and got Hannah out. And there was a bunch of flowers in fresh paper she brought for us. I said, Hannah, if somebody had seen those flowers, don't you think it would have been suspicious? Flowers, fresh bunch in the attic, and they would have looked and looked and looked. So she apologized. I said, what were you thinking? I called you. She said, yeah, I'll listen next time. She was a lonely girl, you know, and she came often to our house. Yeah, we were like family.
I read that you would try to stay warm with a hot water bottle when you studied in your room.
Yeah.
And that Dutch gin bottles, which were earthenware, made for very good hot water bottles. What happened when you mistook a gin bottle filled with water?
Well, my mother and Leon Northam were very depressed about the news, so they decided to buy a bottle of gin. They had little glasses in the bottle. I don't drink gin. And I saw that bottle, I thought it was my bottle. And I poured it out, and I smelled it was gin. And Leon came in the room and smelled it, and he started laughing like a hyena. He thought that was very funny. But they had just paid 60 guilders for it, you know? And he was laughing and laughing, and they all came running. What's so funny? What's so funny? She threw away the gin. So we had a lot of laughs, you wouldn't believe it. This sounds stupid, right? Silly. But we needed a laugh sometimes.
It helps you survive through the dark.
Yeah, yeah. And we were very together, you know? We were very close friends, people that finally remained at the end, you know?
Did all of your friends make the same choices that you made to help Jews or to join the underground? Or did you
Well, I was part of a sorority that was specializing in hiding Jewish children. And I could call them and say, I need an address for a 14-year-old boy. Oh, that's going to be difficult. Who's going to take a 14-year-old boy? But they always came up with an address, always.
Were there people around you who refused to do this kind of thing?
Most people.
Most people?
Yeah. Were scared. That's scary, you know? Very few people really did it, even though I can say thousands of people did it out of millions, you know? Yeah, well, we were lucky that we rented rooms, and we had this sort of B&B excuse, you know? So that we had people coming and going and sleeping there. But it's true, I had people who were, a Jewish couple were hiding with a grandfather, we called him, an old man, and he was living alone. And they, around him, he was a little house, and he had a lot of neighbors around him. And they were really not going out except at the very dark at night. And they rolled up their beds every morning, and he hid them till the end of the war. But he had to be more careful than we were because of the neighbors, yeah. And there were people who had Dutch Nazis as neighbors. And so they had to walk in slippers, they couldn't flush the toilet, they couldn't listen to the radio if nobody was home, and they couldn't stand in front of the window. And my friend Brom was in a house like that, and the girl had epileptic fits. And of course she managed to have a fit when they were alone. Well, he was taught how to handle it, put something in her mouth, and he was very careful. He was very careful, keep his distance. That way he was pretty clever. But he was a fearless man. It was very interesting. One house after another that he was hiding in. He was in and out of our house too, but my mother, since we had broken up, wasn't welcoming him too much. Anyway, he was in one house after another where it was raided by the Gestapo. Well, every house was. But he hid in a laundry basket one time. They didn't find him. He hid behind the wainscoting another time, and they didn't find him. And except this apartment where in February 45, then they were all caught. But he was 4 times in a house that was raided, and he acted like it didn't bother him. He was a bit out of it sometimes. He was totally obsessed with physics. Brom was fearless. It was very strange in a way. He talked physics with a professor who came visit him from Leiden, and a good friend who was a physicist. And he focused on that. And Nick Coury said he would have got a Nobel Prize if he had been in his 20s in this country. He was so brilliant. That's what they said. Well, at the end of the war, the Gestapo was all called to the front. So there were very few. And the only Gestapo that was left were those who answered calls for betrayal. And somebody betrayed my friends who had rented an apartment. So there was Titsa, her sister Jana, and her husband, Leon Northeim, and my ex-boyfriend, Bram Pijs. They lived together, and they were so happy because now they were on their own, you know, not in somebody's home. And but when they were arrested, a physicist was working with Bram, called me and said they're all arrested. So I immediately went there, knowing I was going to be arrested, of course. And, you know, it takes really guts. So I rang the bell, and I said, I'm selling potatoes. You're under arrest, you're Jewish. And they kept me there for hours. But I found out who the Sachbearbeiter was, and where my friends were in the Dutch Amsterdam jail. And I got the girls out, and I got Bram out. I went to the head of the Gestapo, and I didn't know what price I had to pay, but I did it. And I said, you know, he is just a Wissenschaftler. He is a Jew, but he's a Wissenschaftler. He said, yeah, he didn't even have false papers. I said, well, good for him. But it was because they were in repair, you know. Anyway, so this guy called the jail and said, you have a Jew, and Jude Pijs there? And obviously they said yes. They knew his voice. He didn't introduce himself. And let him go. Let him gain. And so Brom that day came home to us. So I went quite back to get Leon out. So now I went for Leon Northeim. Well, I had found out when I was in their apartment that they found underwear of his and Janet. They were married in the same master bedroom. So there was Rassenschande. He was a Jew and she went for non-Jews. And he never betrayed her, of course. But so I came there, and again he called the jail, and did he have a Jew Northeim? And he said to me, he's shot. Not one word, cool as a cucumber. But I didn't have to pay any price, which I didn't know what it was might be. But he was not interested. He was very depressed. They had lots of war. By now it was March 45, you know. Yeah.
Tina, in 1941 or 1942, when the Nazis were still
very active.
And
there were 70,000 of them, I heard. I can't believe that number, but, and I'm not good with numbers. Maybe it was 7,000. But they raided every single house. They visited every single house in the country.
Did it occur to you then that they might never leave? Did you think, what if they're here forever?
Yeah, I said to my mother, said, you know, this could get us killed. I said, well, who wants to live with those guys? So that was my answer. I don't want to live under Hitler. I said, so I'm going to do everything I can to save people. And my mother said, I agree, I agree. What has helped me, what has been very therapeutic for me, because of course I was traumatized by this experience of 5 years of occupation. And you know, every day something terrible happened almost. And so what has helped me is that a lot of synagogues and Jews and people like you want to hear what happened. And so when I tell the story to a sympathetic audience, it's like therapy, you know? You relive it, but each time I cry less. So I have a sympathetic audience, and that's just like a therapist, you know? So that's how I've kind of healed from that trauma. And so, but at first, my mother and I felt guilty that we didn't do more. We could have done more, we could have done more. And we talked about that, and my mother said, well, I made a list, and we almost had 100 people in our house. I said, oh, that's so good, but we lost the list. You know, we weren't proud enough in a way of it. You know, I had a call a year ago. He said, I'm the grandson of Hans de Jong, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you and your mom. And he was studying here. He's an economist, and he's studying now in London, School of Economics. And he's coming to visit soon. He wants to look for a job in New York. So last year when I was 90, I wasn't feeling well, and I didn't want to party. But he called that day, and he said, it's your birthday. I said, yeah. How do you know? Well, he knew. And he said, my parents are here. They would like to meet you. The son of Hans de Jong and his wife. And so I had dinner with them. It was just like family. It was so nice. Yeah.